Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. And how are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I'm over the moon that you've joined me this evening, because nothing beats a great story. I mean, if you think about the world we live in today, all the terrible things that happen out there, do you know, isn't it wonderful to just come back at the end of a hard day and to be able to listen to a good story? And that's what this channel is all about. And I'm so glad you enjoy these stories as much as I do, because I love sharing them with you. So before we continue with part 2 of our story, if you haven't heard of part 1, please click on the description, because you really don't want to miss out on the whole story, because everything gels together so superbly and every part fits like a jigsaw puzzle, so you don't want to miss out. So let's continue with part 2 of our story. Life continued as normal for Richie after his grandmother had died, but the house with just him in it and Indiza the cat had become a sorrowful place indeed. But the job at the cemetery digging graves for the Rest in Peace funeral home kept him significantly busy and happily preoccupied, so he didn't have to dwell too much on Grandma Rosa's absence. On this occasion he was digging 2 graves side by side each other for a husband and wife who had been tragically killed on a motorbike they had been riding together. Richie had learnt that they'd been flung off the road on a Harley-Davidson by a passing truck, who had come barrelling out of nowhere, according to witnesses, who described the lorry driver as being drunk as a skunk, which Richie thought was rather strange, as he never knew skunks were partial to alcoholic intoxication, but he was well acquainted with their ghastly smell. On one occasion a skunk had sprayed the side of his bicycle, and he couldn't cycle on it for ages, as the residue of that stench made him want to gag. Richie was always sad when he had to dig a grave for someone, no matter who they were, because he had a very generous, loving heart. And given the tragedy that had befallen this loving couple, he hated to see their lives cut short before their time. But the toughest job of all had been digging his own grandmother's grave a few months before. But he was glad it was him who had done it, for it was a privilege to dig the grave of the most beloved, precious person he'd ever known. Richie would visit his grandmother's grave every day, laying down fresh flowers for his grandmother, who was always very partial to white roses, so that is usually what he brought to the grave twice a week, even though his sister Bonnie said once a week was quite enough. But Richie did not want the roses or flowers to droop. They needed to be always in perfect condition, so he'd place them in a vase and replace them rather regularly. On this particular day, as Richie was attending to a grave, that was when he heard the arguing voices in the cemetery. He discreetly moved towards the sound of the raised voices, which was incongruous to hear in a serene, dignified place of rest. Some people clearly had no respect for the dead. No one should be fighting in a cemetery. Richie peered around a tree and observed the couple more closely. They were certainly engaged in a rather heated altercation. At first he thought the argument was rather benign, but it began to escalate out of control, in a way that Richie never saw coming. "Why did you follow me round here?" came the woman's shrill voice. "I can't believe it! You have a nerve! You have no right to follow me here. I have the right to my own privacy, do I not? Because I bloody wanted to know what you got up to, sneaking out of the house all the time, acting so furtively. I have a bloody right to know what you're getting up to behind my back. I wanted to know what the hell you were up to. You had such a suspicious look on your face, which is why I followed you here, and I'm glad I did. I know what's going on here. I'm not stupid. Why you keep buying those goddamn white lilies that were in our kitchen one day, gone the next. I bloody hate lilies. Always have and always will. They're the most frightful flowers known to man," he said, grabbing the lilies from the woman and tearing them apart, so they lay shredded across the ground. "Look what you've done, Ryan! You've ruined these lilies! Why would you do that? How can you be so cruel?" said the woman, her eyes clouding up with tears. "You're so damned mean, Ryan."
Why did I tear up these lilies? Ask me a stupid question, Jeanette, and I'll give you a stupid answer. I know what you've been doing, sneaking behind my back to the cemetery all the time. I can't say that I'm remotely surprised about this. Your late husband is dead. Get that, Jeanette? He's dead. But what do? You still swoon over his corpse like a bee over a honeypot. But you never fuss over me like this. No, I'm lucky if I bloody get a look in. You barely notice me these days when I return home from a hard day at the office, slaving my guts out to give you a good life. You're so caught up in your illusional world. Look at me, Jeanette. I'm a living, breathing man. Do you know how pathetic it is to see you behaving like this? How can I even compete with a bloody dead man? If you sneakily do these kind of things behind my back, what else are you getting up to when I'm not looking? For all I know, while I'm at work, you're entertaining the dustbin man in our bedroom. I wouldn't be remotely surprised.
It's not pathetic, Ryan. This is my late husband we're talking about. He's been dead for a long time. Have I not got the right to pay him my respects? And I won't dignify your insinuations about a dustbin man with an ounce of credibility. I can't believe you have so little faith in me, and have the audacity to make such a cruel suggestion. I've never bloody cheated on you in my life, and you talk to me like this. It's so disrespectful.
Well then, what are you doing out here? That's the problem, Jeanette. Don't you bloody see what's going on here? You're always buying bloody lilies, and then they vanish behind my back. You must have been coming to this gravesite for years and years, putting flowers by his grave, and I never knew what you were getting up to. You are bloody cheating on me with a dead man. How do you think that makes me feel? That's the way I see it. You couldn't even be bloody honest about this to me, which makes this whole sordid, slippery business a damn sight more conniving and scheming. I found the shoebox under the bed, crammed with all his photographs. I thought we agreed you'd put them away. But behind my back, you're looking at the pictures of a bloody dead man. You are in a relationship with me, not with him. He's bloody gone, Jeanette. Get that into your thick head. He's gone. He's not coming back. Dead is dead. You're always comparing me to your first husband. You think he's much better than me, don't you? You wish I was the one lying under the ground and that Jimmy was alive, don't you? You're always saying, Jimmy this, Jimmy that, Jimmy the next thing. What about bloody me? Do you think I have no goddamn feelings?
I don't know where you're going with this, Ryan. You're the one that's sounding ridiculous, not me. I was married to Jimmy for a long time. Yes, I loved him. I never ever knew you at the time. I miss Jimmy. I come here to pay my respects, and it's none of your business, none of your damn business what I do. And what is wrong with paying my respects to Jimmy? I don't tell you because you're bloody jealous. Why are you insanely envious of my late husband? It's completely ridiculous. Like you say, he's dead.
Because you never loved me like you loved Jimmy. Isn't it obvious? I've seen your old wedding pictures. Never once have you looked at me like you looked at that bloody Jimmy. You're only with me because Jimmy is no longer around, and that's the truth.
And you know why, Ryan? I keep looking at those pictures of my late husband. Do you want to bloody know why? I'll tell you, but it'll hurt your ears to listen. But listen hard. Jimmy was not insecure all the time, breathing down my back, always checking up on me. And Jimmy never once laid a hand on me like you have. So yes, if you want to know the truth, you don't even hold a candle to Jimmy. He was the love of my life. You'll never ever compare with him. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. See if I bloody care. Now leave me the hell alone and give me some breathing space to be with the man who is my real husband.
The man I would still be with if he was still around. It's tragic he isn't. You are not my first choice, Ran. You're very right about that. Because sadly and very stupidly, I thought it was better to be with you than being alone. Silly, silly me. Well, that's what I thought at the time. I must have been so delusional. Marrying you, Ran, was a grievous mistake. Hear that? A grievous mistake. I wish I'd never married you. I was so much better off being on my own, and happier too. You can bet on that.
What happened next surprised Richie. The next thing he knew, there was a fraught, frantic scuffle as the woman tried to push her deranged, hot under-the-collar husband off her. "Get off me, Ran! You're hurting me! You're choking me! I can't breathe! Please stop! Leave me alone!" But her whimpering, futile efforts to get her husband off her were fruitless. She tried to fiercely fight back with all her might, but he flung her onto the ground, crawling over her like a lion, reaching for the jugular. The woman was fighting back, oscillating her arms and legs as hard as she could, but she was no match for her hard-boiled, unwavering, resolute husband. Soon the strong-willed, unflinching man had savagely pinned her on the ground so hard. His thick fingers were around her neck. He was beginning to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze. And when Richie saw the incensed, manic, frenzied expression on the man's face, and the dark hostility that clouded his eyes, his grandmother's warning words reverberated in his head, loudly and clearly. "By their fruit you will know them, Richie dear." In that moment, Richie knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he had come face to face with the devil himself.
"Is that right? You're better off without me, are you? I tell you what, Jeanette, if you miss your ex-husband so much, how about I send you right to him? Then you can be with him for the rest of your life. Would you like that?"
"Stop it, Ryan! Please stop it! You're hurting me! Get your hands off me! You're choking me! I can hardly breathe!"
"Well, that's not my problem, is it? You brought that on yourself. You deserve everything you're getting."
Richie watched in abject horror, hardly believing what was unfolding before him, as the man continued to squeeze. The woman's hands were going limp. They fell at her side like the arms of a rag doll. She stopped fighting back. Her eyes began to roll in the back of their sockets, almost becoming glassy. Richie did not hesitate. He ran towards the man, who, much like the Great Dane he'd seen in the doggy park, attacking the poor vulnerable black Labrador, the man was clearly trying to kill his wife. Richie raised up the trowel he used for digging the grave, blasted it across the back of this man's head. He had no time to react. The man fell over, collapsing onto the ground in a motionless heap. For a second or two, Richie thought he was dead, until he saw the rise and fall of the man's chest. For a moment the woman remained very still, and Richie worried it was all too late for her. The devil was lying on the ground concussed, but he had already killed the poor woman. It was all too late. But the woman seemed to suddenly come around from her delirium. She sat up with a start, staring at both Richie and her husband on the ground, with a look of stunned bemusement on her face. It seemed like her eyes were like glass marbles for a while, but as the blood circulation increased, life seemed to return to them. But the woman seemed slow to digest what was going on around her. She had blacked out for a while, and was trying to regain her bearings. She stared vacantly at her surroundings, as if she thought she was caught up in an insidious nightmare, from which she would surely awaken. But soon she realized none of this had actually been a dream. Her husband had really tried to kill her. The woman began to cough and splutter. She clutched her neck, that was clearly causing her a great deal of pain. The angry red tide marks stood out obtrusively. It was likely she'd suffer from extensive, rather horrific bruising. The woman had narrowly escaped certain death. Richie had saved her life. Richie was heartily relieved to see the woman very much alive, but still recovering from the shock of what had ensued. She had not expected the devil to try and kill her. That was the problem with the devil. He was a trickster, and people underestimated how cunning he could be. Richie knew that the woman should not have taunted the devil, because the devil had a very bad temper. Richie was not sure how old the woman was, but she was very pretty, and when she got up from the ground, her eyes were filled with tears. The pretty white sundress she was wearing was now heavily soiled by muddy patches, which was a dreadful pity, because it was a rather nice dress. But the devil never liked white. You could see the flower heads of the white lilies had been cruelly beheaded. They were lying scattered all around the gravesite, because the devil loathed anything light, and white was his worst colour. Richie's grandmother had told him this. The woman staggered awkwardly to her feet, brushing away the crumbs of dirt from her dress. The French plait she had worn was coming apart, and tentacles of loose curly blonde hair tumbled around her face. "Thank you, she said, staring at Richard awkwardly. "He tried to kill me. You saw, didn't you? He tried to kill me." Richie could see the red marks even closer on the woman's neck. They were worse than he imagined, and getting worse by the second. She really was swelling up. She wiped away the tears on her face, staring at her husband's unflinching body in disgust, as if she was looking at a pile of filthy linen that she'd rather discard in the refuge than put into the washing drum on a hot cycle. Richie nodded. "The devil comes to steal, kill and destroy," he told her. "He tried to kill you. You're very lucky the devil didn't kill you. He was very angry. It didn't help you were wearing white. The devil hates white. My grandmother Rosa said he hates the light, and anything white is very bad for him." "Is he dead?" the woman asked, leaning over the body lying on the ground with a level of insouciance. "He's still breathing. Oh, my God. You knocked him out cold. But he's still going to come around soon enough. More's the pity. Just leave him, I say. Leave him here in the cemetery, will you? He can rot in hell for all I care. When he wakes up, I'll present him with divorce papers. I'm going home to change the locks and file a restraining order against him." She kicked the concussed man with her shoe, and then ran through the cemetery to the carport, where Richie could hear her attacking the engine furiously and driving away at a manic speed from the place as fast as she could. The devil could do that to you. He could make people terribly upset. Richie reasoned what he should do. If he left the devil here in the cemetery, he might harm another unsuspecting woman visiting a gravesite, and especially if she was carrying white lilies in her hands, and God forbid if she was wearing white. That would set him off again into a manic state. Richie reasoned what he should do. If he left the devil here in the cemetery, he might do grievous harm to another unsuspecting woman visiting a gravesite, especially if she was carrying white lilies or roses in her hand, and God forbid if she was wearing white. That would set him off manically. Richard reasoned that an unbridled maniac like this was a dangerous threat indeed. The devil had treacherously come a hair's breadth away from killing his wife. Richie didn't want to personally kill the devil, although it would be a very good thing if he was dead. But Richie hated killing anything. He couldn't even bear to kill a spider or an ant. So he'd do the next best thing. He'd keep the devil chained in the basement of his home. The devil could not harm anyone else that way. He knew his Grandma Rosa would approve of him taking swift action against this menacious evil entity. The thought of defeating the devil pleased him greatly. But after a few days spent in the basement, the situation was getting increasingly worrisome and rather thorny. The immoral, degenerate, ungodly threats being yelled up from the basement had been the most vile, unholy, heinous things imaginable. As his grandmother had said, "By their fruit, Richie dear, you will know them." This man was spitting out thorns and briars. If he were a tree, you'd cut him down at once, turning him into firewood. But it wasn't easy. when the devil was made of flesh and blood.
You get me out of here! You take me out of these chains, do you hear me? Who the hell do you think you are? I'll kill you! I'll kill you, do you hear that? You are a monster! Look what you've done to me! Take me out of my chains! Wait until I get my hands around your neck! I'll kill you! You understand that?
By all accounts, things in the basement were not looking good. The atmosphere was getting tenser and tenser, and the vindictive, spiteful words that bounced up the stairs like a ping-pong ball towards Richie's ears were getting disturbingly more perverse. The man called Richie every woman's body part, to be as derogatory and insulting as he could. The bile he spewed out was filthy. Then there were the F-bombs he spat out like the pips from a bunch of grapes, with absolutely no restraint whatsoever. Richie perceived that the devil was the most disgusting man he had ever had the pleasure to meet. Grandma Rosa would have been appalled at such a venomous tongue like he had. It was a good thing, Richie thought. She wasn't here to listen to any of this. The words would have given Aunt Rosa heart palpitations. Things got exponentially worse when the sun went down every evening, and an inky darkness descended over the infirmament. This is when, in the dark shadows of Grandma Rosa's home, Richie would shuffle very quietly and clandestinely to the basement door to see if he could hear the devil breathing. All he could hear was the click and clank of the chain that Richard had used to tie the devil's ankle to the ground, along with the volatile utterances of an extremely disturbed, very angry man who had murder on his mind, for he kept muttering about how he was going to kill Richie. I'm going to string you apart, tear off your limbs, remove your skin, gouge out your eyes, cut out your tongue, he would mumble over and over again. But Richie wasn't afraid of the devil's threats, but he wasn't comfortable hosting such an unpleasant guest in his house, for the devil's darkness had robbed Grandma Rosa's home of its normal congenial ambience. Richie noticed the devil had mentioned his desire to tear him apart was over 1,053 times, which was an awful lot for 2 to 3 days. He knew it was wrong to feed the enemy, but Richie couldn't help himself. He had been taking the devil food and drinks to the basement regularly, giving him a bucket for his ablutions, but he no longer knew what to do about the devil, so he called his sister Bonnie for help. But when he phoned her in the middle of the night, no words came out, but she had told him to hang on, that everything would be all right. She'd be over in a moment. Richie breathed a sigh of relief. Bonnie would know what to do about the devil. Bonnie's account.
Who was that?
Asked my husband, yawning, as I disconnected the call from my brother Richie. My heart was pounding rather violently in my chest. I knew my brother was in some kind of trouble, and my husband was not always desperately sympathetic towards my brother's plight. I shuffled awkwardly out of bed and threw on a pair of jogging pants and a sweater.
Where the hell are you going?
My husband asked, studying me through narrowing eyes.
You're not going out at this time of night, surely?
If you must know, I'm going to see Richie.
What?
Said Earl, looking at me incredulously.
Have you lost leave of your senses, Bonnie? Look at the time. It's 1:10 in the bloody morning. You have work in a few hours. You can't just bugger off like this in the middle of the night. You'll be exhausted by the time you go to work.
Richie tried to phone me. He couldn't articulate any words when he spoke down the phone. He's in grievous trouble. I know he is. I need to make sure he's all right. When he's like this, something has really upset him. I know my brother very well, you see.
For God's sake, Bonnie. Your brother is 38 years old. He's old enough to look after himself. So what if he had water on the brain when he was born? He's managed to live independently very well on his own. He doesn't need you running after him all the time like a nursemaid, mopping up his spilt milk after him. I'm sure whatever is troubling him, he'll manoeuvre his way around it somehow. There is always a way out of any kind of scrape. You know there is. I'm sure it's nothing to concern yourself about."
"You don't know Richie like I do. He's become much more vulnerable since Granny Rosa died. I need to check up on him to make sure he's all right." My husband groaned, rolling over on his side.
"If it makes you feel better, do it," he said,
throwing the pillow over his head in mock surrender and returning back to his sleep. I was trembling as I climbed into my vulva. I had a profound sense that something was terribly wrong, but what it was, I wasn't sure. My whole body was trembling as I made my way to Grandma Rosa's house, and when I parked my car outside her home, I could see Richie standing there in the arched doorway. He looked dishevelled, and for a man so strapping in size, he seemed slumped over like a willow tree, with a forlorn kind of stoop posture that conveyed to me at once that my brother was feeling overwhelmed. He had been rather like that after Granny Rosa had died, so I knew something had grievously upset him. "What is it, Richie?" I asked, approaching him. "You look as white as a sheet." Richie mumbled something under his breath in a quiet whisper.
"The devil," he said. "The devil's in my basement. I tied him up with a chain. He was attacking a woman in the cemetery. He tried to strangle her. I had to save her life and protect any other ladies that came to the cemetery, especially the ladies that bring white lilies. The devil can't stand white."
"I can't stand him being here a moment longer, Bonnie," he said. "He spits vile, ugly words. I don't like such horrible words in my home. I want him to go, but I can't get rid of him. He might hurt someone. What am I to do, Bonnie?" he asked me pleadingly. I looked at my brother incredulously, hardly believing what he was telling me. He was claiming he'd tied up the devil in the basement of Grandma Rosa's home. My brother was the most gentle soul you could ever hope to meet, and it was unlike him to do something like this. But someone had attacked a woman in a cemetery. My brother genuinely perceived that the man he had tied up in the basement was the devil himself. Richie had no doubt about that in his mind. He thought he was doing something for the greater good of humanity. He had given the devil a mattress to sleep on, food to eat, water to drink, and a bucket for his ablutions, but the man had no gratitude at all. I managed to persuade my brother that I needed to see the devil for myself and to speak with him in person. When I met the contemptible man in the basement, I could see why my brother Richie had concluded he was a devil, for he certainly was behaving like one. He was spitting filth at the two of us, but anyone who'd been chained up for a few days was unlikely to be in a very good mood. The man was incensed. His eyes were like daggers, so round with anger. I'm surprised they didn't pop out of his head.
"What the hell is going on here?"
said the man, screaming up at me when I entered the room.
"You see that man over there? He's deranged. He's crazy. He's a complete fruitcake. He tied a chain to my ankle. He's been feeding me like an animal. You better get me out of here, lady. Do you bloody understand? Or I shan't be responsible for my actions. Get it, you bitch. Get me out of here. What the F is wrong with you people?"
"There is no need to speak to me like that, sir. I'm very sorry about your current predicament. I'll let you go," I told him reassuringly. "But you must understand, my brother, well, you know, he's got issues. He's got mental health problems, you could say. But he's a very harmless individual."
"Harmless? My foot! There's nothing harmless about your brother."
The man spat at the floor in disgust.
"Your brother should be locked up. He's insane. That's what he is. He's locked me up in the basement. For bloody what, I ask you? He's deluded. He needs to be taken to a mental institution and locked up. What the blazes is wrong with him? I've been here for over 3 days.
"It's not the end of the world, sir," I told him. "I'm very sorry this happened to you, but my brother told me what you did. You're lucky you're not being in prison charged for murder. What my brother told me you did to your wife is insane. I'll make a deal with you. If you say nothing to the police about my brother taking you prisoner in his home, I won't say anything to the police about the woman you tried to kill. Your wife, I believe it was. Your brother is a bloody liar. I'd never tried to kill my wife. We had a minor disagreement, that's all. And the next thing I know, your bloody brother attacks me with a trowel for no reason at all, hits me on the back of the head. I woke up here, not knowing where the hell I was. How do you think that made me feel? I've known my brother for over 38 years. Granted, he thinks differently to most people, but he has the kindest heart. And one thing I know for sure, he's never told a lie. If he claims you tried to kill your wife, I believe him. He won't exaggerate things. He never has and never will. I will back him up in a court of law. So do we have a deal or not? The man was spitting with rage and cursing, so I began to walk away. I see you can't be reasoned with, sir, I told him. I will renegotiate all this with you when you finally come to your senses and have calmed down a wee bit. I'm sorry, but I don't want my brother being locked up in some mental institution indefinitely because he put a stop to you killing your wife. And you are very lucky he did that, because if your wife was dead, you'd likely be in prison for life, or maybe on death row, waiting to be executed. Do you hear me? Waiting to be executed. So 3 days spent prisoner down here in my brother's cellar. That's a small price to pay. You got off lightly. My brother saved you from committing an atrocity. You should be grateful to him. You really did get off lightly, in my opinion. You're a lucky man.
All right, said the man, holding his hand up in a mock surrender, his hoarse voice softening in its tone. You make a good point there. Let me go. We'll say no more about this, shall we? You have your deal, lady. I'm a reasonable man. Get me the hell out of here. I studied him curiously, not knowing whether I could really trust him or not. Was I making the right choice, setting him free like this? But he couldn't stay in my brother's basement indefinitely. So in the end, with a vacillating hesitancy and a dark sense of foreboding that kept nudging me, telling me not to do it, I reluctantly released him from the chain that had tied his ankle to the floor. The man's back straightened up. He stood up on 2 feet, at about 6 foot tall. His face jiggled with indignation. His eyes narrowed stubbornly, furiously focusing on Richie, with a formidable glare. He then growled, and his whole body seemed to rattle precariously, so that the entire basement floor began to wobble and shake. The man shrieked, "I'm going to string you alive, you bloody bastard!" Then there he was, savagely making a direct beeline towards Richie, and with a belligerent, murderous, rabid look that was as manic as a charging bull elephant, I knew Richie was living on borrowed time, for the man had picked up the fire poker that Richie had left on the ground, so it was easily accessible to him in an adverse situation, should this devil get out of hand. But now the weapon was being used against him, against us, and I knew in my recoiling gut that this was not going to end well. What on earth had I done? I should not have let this man go without a sensible supervision of some kind. He was bubbling over like an inferno. In truth, he looked homicidal and bloodthirsty, like a wild animal that I had unwittingly unleashed into Grandma Rosa's home. I was in no doubt this man was capable of committing murder in cold blood. You could see it so clearly on his face. He was screaming at my brother. All kinds of dreadful insults, filthy words just popped out of his mouth unapologetically. "I'm going to bloody kill you, and then I'll deal with your sister." I was now speechless, privately cursing myself for my insane stupidity. I was trembling and quaking so much. The most sensible thing would have been for me to call the police, but I did not. I was caught up in the moment, determined to help my brother in any way I could. My brother had speedily bolted out of the front door,
with this insidious, ferocious, cantankerous man running right after him, while I trailed behind, screaming, "Please stop! Please stop! This is crazy! Let's talk about this!" I was now inwardly cursing myself for letting this contemptible man go. But what else was I supposed to do? I was trying to get my brother out of a pickle. Now I was likely going to get him killed, myself included in the process. I knew this man was exceedingly dangerous. He had a temper on him that was explosive, and his anger appeared to be insatiable. If there was one thing I was exceedingly grateful about on this inauspicious bodeful night, which would have been mellow and light-hearted in its temperament, had it not been cruelly injected with the poisonous bile-like venom of the man my brother called the devil, and that was that the temperature was relatively mild, pleasantly warm, with a cool breeze blowing against my face, and better still, the pearly moon was so full and bright, like a generous street light, so I could see reasonably well, and as luck would have it, I had a tiny torch on a keychain that was in the pocket of my jeans, given to me by my husband, which was a stroke of good fortune, for the tiny torch packed a big punch and offered a great illumination. I was so pleased that my brother was running as fast as he could into the woodgrove, as that gave him a fighting chance to escape, and he could find a piece of timber to use for defence purposes against this vindictive, vile man. My heart was pounding as I ran, so very violently in my chest. I was as frantic as a bird caught up in the jaws of a cat. My legs seemed to almost crumble beneath me, as if they'd been weighed down with cement. But the one thing I did seem to be able to do was scream. And boy, did I scream! I screamed, and the sound of my screams echoed back to me. I think at one point my invasive screams even disturbed the crickets and frogs, because they all suddenly became mute. In a burst of unexpected energy, I sprinted through the trees, and with the large spaces in the open canopy above my head, inviting prisms of soft moonlight to dance over the forest floor, through the tall lofty trees, things were not nearly as intimidating as they could have been. I remember feeling heartily annoyed with all that screaming, wished that whoever was making such a commotion would actually just shut up, when it suddenly dawned on me that the screaming was coming from me. The worst thing happened, and my dreadful fears were about to be realized. The man had seized my brother by the collar, flung him onto the ground forcefully, and my brother was no small man. I saw him on the ground, staring up in terror at the man who was about to bludgeon him to death with the fire-poker.
"Please, no," said my brother. "You should have thought about that before you locked me up in your bloody basement. Now you're going to pay big time for what you've done, because I'm going to smash your skull in all over the earthen floor."
"Please no! Please no!" I screamed, running up to my brother's side. "Please don't do this to him! Please don't do this to him! You've got this all wrong! You need to understand. My brother doesn't think like normal people. He's different. He thought you were the devil when you tried to kill your wife. You've got to understand. You can't hurt him. You really can't. You can't do this to him. Please, I beg you, let's talk about this."
"We are not going to talk about anything. This man locked me up. He's going to pay for it. Do you understand that? He's going to pay for it."
I was too gobsmacked to know how to react in these bizarre, very strange circumstances that had become so surreal that I was seriously beginning to wonder if I was dreaming. For a moment the man whom my brother called the devil was about to pulverize him with one forceful deadly strike. He stopped midway, and he looked up to see what was hurtling towards him at the speed of the wind, and that's when he saw the giant hairy humanoid thundering towards him. The last words he ever uttered were,
"What the hell is that?"
Things were getting stranger and more cryptic by the second. I had to rub my eyes again and again to assure myself that no, I was not caught up in a fictitious dream, that all this was real. for I was observing a 9-foot female Bigfoot. She grabbed the man by the cuff of his collar with a powerful overlong arm and threw him on the ground forcefully, as if he weighed no more than a little feather. The man my brother called the devil began to scream. This female Bigfoot, using a powerful foot, pressed down on the devil's skull, smashing it to pieces, so the brain matter seeped out of his head. And honestly, he was like a crushed bug, but I felt no pity for him, only manifold relief, as things could have panned out so incredibly differently. The female Bigfoot spoke to us in an incongruous language that I did not understand, that clearly had indigenous origins, and sounded as if it might be ancient. It seemed to translate itself into our heads. Gelaquisa, colati lakina. I'm sorry you had to see that. Not pleasant, I know. Golamikasi, lo fasi quasina. But his murderous energy was burning the wood. I could smell it a mile away. And your screams, she said, looking at me through her treacle-colour eyes, were the perfect map to find your location. I'm glad I got here in time. Galiquisa, hopatilaniqua, fisakisako, malitana. Thank you, I said. You saved our lives. I don't know how to thank you enough. Gilati. Glad to be of service, said the Bigfoot. Golopikasi, matilawa. Now, if you pardon me, I really must go. Kulutu pasina. I have a hungry child that needs feeding. And with that, she was gone. She moved away as if she was floating on air. And I found myself wondering, did that really just happen? Since that extraordinary, remarkable event, I have been drawing the Bigfoot in charcoal, trying to put down the details of her image onto paper, so that I will never ever forget her. She was about 9 foot tall, possibly even taller, with a distinguished human face, and a robust, powerful build. But it was those twinkling eyes that were so incredibly beautiful, that I shall never ever forget. When people see the picture I've drawn, they say to me, "You'd think based on this, you really have seen a Bigfoot before. Your work is amazing." I never tell them it is because I have seen one. When you have an idiosyncratic encounter like this, that touches you to the quick, you'd be surprised to learn that you really don't want to tell anyone about the experience. It is so deeply personal, so magical, incredibly spiritual. Even my brother remains mute about the subject, but he believes the Bigfoot was an angel sent by Grandma Rosa. As for that horrible, duplicitous man, his body was recovered. People assumed he'd been mauled by a bear, but I know different, and you do too. And in my opinion, that man may not have been the devil, but he certainly was related to him in some way. So there you are. That's my story. Well, wasn't that the most fabulous story? And I felt so much for Richie with his learning difficulties. And he had this incredible ability to count how many times you said something, and a remarkable memory. In fact, I have to tell you, I have a cousin of mine who has the ability. He's got a learning disorder, and he will be able to tell you dates that you would never remember, dates when this happened and dates when that happened, because that side of his brain has been actively stimulated. So he's brilliant in that regard. And you can see that Richie had a similar talent. He, could see things very differently through very different eyes. And in his opinion, this man attacking the woman was the devil himself. And in many ways, judging by the man's behaviour, he certainly was a devil. And I don't feel too much remorse for him being crushed to death by that Bigfoot, because it sounds like those two people would not have got away with their lives if he had had his way with that fire poker. So there we are. That's the story. I look forward to hearing your reviews. I think it was fabulous. Until next time, goodbye and good night.